Hi, it's Sean Acor again, and today I want to talk about the research, the incredible research behind how we could actually change the way our brain responds to stress, not only in the midst of a crisis, but in the midst of stress that we feel all throughout our life. One of my favorite experiments to do with the students that I first started with at Harvard, and I've done this with companies around the world, and with schools and with hospitals in 50 countries, is to ask them, what are the 3 moments in your life, the 3 moments that you feel like caused you to become the person you are today? The 3 pivotal times in your life that transformed who you are sitting here watching this today. So we have people write them down, and they take a little bit to think about it. And then we read back through them, and it turns out between 80 to 90% of the things that people write down were actually high stress situations. They got fired from a job. They didn't get into the college they wanted to. They broke up with someone, and then they found the person that they were going to marry. They went on a vacation and everything went wrong, but then they discovered a friendship that led to a marriage. They lost a job, and it turned out that they got an even better job in the future. They lost a member of their family, but it brought their entire family together. In the midst of all of these experiences, what we kept noticing over and over again is that the majority of the things that cause us to be the person that we love about ourselves, the person that we want to be, the person that we become, the best part of ourselves, were actually created in the midst of high stress situations. But if you think about it, our normal response to stress is, how do I decrease stress in my life? How do I flee from the stress that I feel within my life? And yet, maybe we're fleeing from the very things that cause us to be the kind of person that we want to be within this world. When we have that mindset shift, something dramatic happens in terms of psychology and in science that I want to share with you here today about how the human body works and how the brain interacts with that. So in a study that I did at a large Swiss bank in the middle of the banking crisis, I went out and traveled to all their banking centers when we thought that the economy was absolutely going to collapse. We had no idea if the economy would ever recover, because if the banks fail, everyone would look for money, it wouldn't be there, and then no one would have a job. In the midst of that chaos and stress, we looked to see how they were dealing with stress in the midst of that situation, much like we're feeling stress in our home in the midst of quarantine. So what we noticed was that the normal response to stress, the stress management programs that they were putting people through, was actually causing people to become sicker and more stressed. The reason for that is they would come into a stress management course, and they put up a PowerPoint slide, and they'd say, did you know that stress is related to the 10 leading causes of death and disease in the United States? Next slide. Do you know that the World Health Organization found stress to be the #1 killer? Next slide. Stress is catabolic. It tears down every single organ in your body. So whatever you do at work, don't stress. You hear that information, what does it make you feel? Right? It makes you feel stressed, because we created a fight or flight response to our fight or flight response. We're trying to fight or flee against the response that's already trying to fight or flee from things that are going on in our life. Google images of stress, just type in stress and Google it and go to images, and you see people's heads exploding. That's our understanding of what stress is within this world. And it makes sense, of course, that stress would be something we want to fight or flee from, because it would be terrible. But we just talked about that great research where we found that the majority of the things that cause us to become the person we want to be were actually in high stress situations. So something's going on here. So I met up and started working with Peter Salovey, who's now the president of Yale, and Alia Crum, who's one of my students, who's now an incredible professor at Stanford University in mindfulness. And what we were looking for is, could we change the way that we dealt with stress that allowed our bodies and our brains to respond in a more adaptive way? So we were fighting against decades worth of research. So we went in and we split up the managers, and half of the managers, we told them, stress is bad for you. Embedded within stress is all of those negative things. So whatever you do, here's some tools we're going to give you right now to fight or flee from stress as much as you possibly can, right? Think how much we're doing that in the midst of quarantine, right? Like, we try and fight or flee from stress. We read articles about how to decrease stress within our life. We feel stress. We know something's going terribly wrong in our life because we're feeling stressed, and then we're not feeling happy. And then there's a problem and we feel guilty about it. We turn to alcohol to be like, how do I actually decrease the amount of stress within our life? In the midst of all those things, what we're doing is we're fighting or fleeing from stress. So the other group, though, we told them embedded within every stress is meaning. In fact, stress is actually enhancing to the body. If you think about it, if a zebra is about to get attacked by a lion, that's right when you'd want your stress response to actually improve your immune system in case you get scratched. You want your growth hormones to rebuild your cells faster than anything we've seen. And that's exactly what happens. In the midst of high levels of stress, we actually see your body respond with higher levels of immunity and higher levels of these growth hormones to rebuild your cells for a short time. But then we also find that over the long term, we're not talking about eustress or good stress right now. We're pushing all that aside. I'm talking about long-term levels of stress. Those levels of stress, it turns out for some people, it actually causes their immune system to improve. These are the people that don't get sick when they have tons of work to do. They get sick when they have holidays, right? These are, I'm working with Colonel Rideout at Camp Pendleton, working with 6 battalions of Marines out there. He had me come out there, and one of the things that we learned, and that he and I were talking about, was that a lot of companies are like, we're going through so much stress right now, we're going to lose good people, and they're just not going to be able to work very well, and their brains are going to shatter. And then with the military, they don't onboard you with a beach vacation. They onboard you with boot camp, the most stressful situation you go through as a soldier before combat. And the reason they do that is they've spent hundreds of years honing this, because they know if you go through stress with the right lens and with other people instead of alone, turns out that stress creates these meaningful narratives and these social bonds you talk about the rest of your life. So here's my thought. If we're going through a high stress situation, we can hunker down, we can turn to all of our coping mechanisms about stress, or we can look to see what it is about the stress we're experiencing right now, in the midst of having our kids home, in the midst of the work, the uncertainty about economics, if we've lost a job, in the midst of that stress. What I invite us to do is to look for the meaning involved with the stress, because we have the potential of creating social bonds and meaningful narratives that we talk about the rest of our life after this. Much like many people talked about how resilient they became in the midst of the Great Depression, and then that led to them being frugal and building homes and creating families and creating sustainability that created stability. Ever since World War II, we've had another world war. So in the midst of that, we're looking at how do we create these positive changes? So for the other half of the managers in that study, this is a study that we got published in the top psychology journal, and was one of the largest studies we've done on stress in the midst of a crisis. We found that with the other managers, we got them to do a simple 3 idea intervention, let's call it. So the first one was acknowledge the stress you're feeling. That's probably not hard for us to do right now. Just acknowledge that we feel stress. Don't ignore it. Don't flee from it. Don't deny it. Acknowledge the stress you're feeling. Then the very next thing I want you to do is to identify the meaning involved with the stress. This was the turning point for me. Embedded within every stress is meaning. So if I tell you that someone's failing English right now, you don't feel high levels of stress. If I tell you your kid is failing English right now, you feel stressed because there's meaning involved with that relationship. If I tell you your inbox is full of spam, you don't feel stressed. If I tell you your inbox is full of friends or leads you need to get back to, you feel stressed because there's meaning involved with those relationships, even if it's putting food on the table for your family. So what we got people to do is acknowledge the stress, identify the meaning involved with the stress, and then reconnect the emotional feeling that they're having towards that meaning, right? They're experiencing the stress. Now they channel it towards that meaning. So if I'm feeling stressed about that inbox, I think about why this matters, and then I'm going to channel the response towards a meaningful activity instead of a meaningless activity. If I'm thinking I feel stressed about having my kids home and all the work that they have to do, I remind myself it's because I love my child. I wanted to be, to have children. I wanted so much to have children before I even thought we would have children. I almost lost one of my children 3 times in the midst of pregnancy. Think about how much you love them and you care for them, and think about how this education, this precious time that we have, is something we're not going to have, we're going to miss. We will definitely miss this 10, 20 years from now, right? Even though it feels stressful right now, we will miss this because there's meaning involved with our child's smile or the fact that we're helping them overcome something challenging at school. And in the midst of that, when we go back in to do that work, we're doing a very high meaningful activity instead of one that's low. And when we do that, it transforms how stress affects us. What we found in the study was that both groups, 6 weeks later, I thought that the group that saw the meaning involved with their stress levels would drop. It didn't. The stress levels remained at the highest of the stress scale for the groups, both groups. They were in the middle of a crisis, like we are. This will not decrease your stress. But what we found is that with the group that saw the meaning involved with their stress, they had a 23% drop in the negative effects of stress on their body. Headaches, backaches, lower job effectiveness, burnout in their life, depression, those dropped by 23% for the group that saw the meaning involved with their stress, as opposed to feeling stress but forgetting about the meaning in our lives. So that's what I invite you to do today. Stop for a moment and write down the 3 moments in your life. This literally takes a minute to do. Write down 3 things, or just think about it, 3 things in your life that transform you into the person you want to be. If they're high stress situations, then acknowledge the stress you're feeling right now. Figure out why you care so much to feel that stress, and then channel your response to this world towards that, knowing it's meaningful. And when we do so, turns out it transforms how stress affects us. And I believe, just like the soldiers coming out of boot camp, we can create meaningful narratives and deeper social bonds with our family and the people we work with and our neighbors and our friends and our parents. And in the midst of this, we can deepen those social bonds and give us something to talk about for the rest of our life. And it starts by stopping and fleeing and fighting from stress.